Metroid-vanias. I can't get enough of them. This month seems particularly saturated with these exploration-based adventures, what with Chasm, Guacamelee 2, and the game I'm reviewing this week, Dead Cells, being released. I'm prepared for everyone, myself included, to get sick of the term Metroid-vania by the time September rolls around, but I digress. Does Dead Cells manage to stand out from the pack? In terms of gameplay, Dead Cells is an interesting and satisfying experience. While at first glance it appears to be a pretty standard Metroid-vania game, even a short time spent with it reveals that Dead Cells leans a little more heavily on its roguelike aspects, specifically its procedurally generated areas and gear, and its approach to progression. The basic platforming is tight and fast, allowing quick navigation of the game's various areas to become second nature. Your first run through a zone is bound to be slow and cautious, as there's often a high price to be paid for dying, but as you familiarize yourself with each area's threats, you can jet through them with minimal fuss. There are even special timed doors that lock treasure from you if you take too long to reach them, which encourages this speedy approach. The zones in question are all essentially mazes with plenty of treasure-laden dead ends and diverging paths, where you'll use your Metroidvania abilities to progress further along different routes. I particularly like that each potential dead end has a portal that allows you to easily return to the critical path without too much difficulty or time wasted. I also thought the save zones bookending each level provided a much needed breather, where you can upgrade your character while the game's timer pauses until you move on. Just getting from safe zone to safe zone in decent time is really fun and becomes more and more challenging as you progress further, whether that's thanks to interesting level gimmicks, such as the darkness in the Forgotten Sepulchre level, or because you've unlocked new and interesting traversal abilities across previous runs. This, aside from the game's side-scrolling presentation and maze-like map, is the main Metroidvania element Dead Cells utilizes, and it basically lets you pick your path of progression. The areas are all procedurally generated, but the progression of these levels isn't, so getting these new skills acts as a sort of fixed progression point. You lose your equipment, money, and run-specific skills when you die, but it's nice to know that you can achieve hard progress in some form, and seeing a path that you can't explore with your current set of skills is as compelling a reason as any to keep exploring to unlock more skills. Adding to that compulsion to play more is the game's combat, which utilizes a wide range of randomized weapons and abilities from run to run. Whether you're using quick, high critical weapons like the Twin Daggers or Assassin's Blade, or hard heavy hitters like the Broadsword or Hammer, taking on enemies is a gratifying if risky affair. Whacking monsters feels great thanks to the combination of knockback, hit sparks and particle effects, and dodging through enemy attacks feels smooth and intuitive. I was actually sort of stunned to find as many weapon variations as I did across my hours and hours of play. Every run, I thought I'd seen every weapon variety that the game had to offer, and then it would throw me a crossbow, or a whip, or the ability to lob fireballs at my opponents. It keeps every run interesting, and I don't think I found any weapons that I didn't enjoy using, though there are definitely a few that I'm now particularly fond of. Many roguelikes derive their difficulty from not being able to predict the location and regularity of weapons and gear, but I think Dead Cells mitigates this by having all of its options feel equally viable. Sure, I felt better having certain weapons and gear than others, but no run ever felt like a loss from the word go. No, Dead Cells difficulty doesn't come from unfair RNG, at least not for the most part. It's fairly hard because enemies deal significant damage and have varied and interesting ways of attacking you. Some enemies can't be hit from the front, forcing you to dodge behind them. Some enemies can shoot magic through walls and floors. Some enemies teleport after you if you try to run. Individually, none of these foes are super tough, but the game usually throws a handful of them at you at a time, and while it is a challenge, Dead Cells' super tight gameplay generally means that if you die, you either rushed in without a plan, or you just weren't playing well enough. Dead Cells gives you the polished mechanics to work with, it's up to you to survive. Your reward for surviving is progress, in the roguelike sense that you don't get any level checkpoints, but you do get to upgrade yourself. Enemies occasionally drop cells as well as regular currency, and you use these to unlock new gear or perks, which in turn make each run a little easier. As long as you don't die, you essentially get to bank these resources at the end of each level, and eventually the runs do get easier and you get a little further every time. I'm not sure I appreciate having to fight each boss over and over again, but the constant flow of gear unlocks and permanent modifiers for your starting gear makes the game feel rewarding, as well as making the early game more varied. But I really don't like that you have to beat the bosses more than once. On their own, they're challenging and entertaining fights that require smart use of your gadgets, weapons, and perks, and having to fight them once per run undermines the challenge and spectacle of the first time you're successful. I get that this is how roguelikes work, but it just kind of feels unnecessary. Speaking of unnecessary, Dead Cells doesn't really have much of a plot to speak of. Much like Hollow Knight, it takes an indirect approach to narrative and world building, but its procedurally generated world just doesn't lend itself to this style of ambient storytelling quite as well. There's still a decent amount of lore to glean from the details in the environment, it's just that it doesn't feel like these are loose ends to be tied up, but rather random bits of lore that float around independent of any greater narrative. Even though the world doesn't give you much story to mull over, it is presented in an appealing style using a colour palette that ranges from the teals and greens of the dungeons and sewers to the sunset yellows of the castle ramparts. Each area has its own tile set, enemies, and colour scheme, so each run remains visually compelling, even if you have seen the same level over and over again due to your many failures. Character designs are similarly varied, and though you'll see the same green zombie dudes throughout your run, they're often accompanied by a bevy of area-specific foes that range from kinda gross looking to super badass. These elements are all brought to life with a unique art style that blends 2D pixel art with some kind of low-res 3D modeling, and at the end of the day, it looks spectacular. Don't ask me what the actual term for this art style is, because I can't say I've ever seen anything like Dead Cells before. On top of that, the game's soundtrack is perfect for hours and hours of dungeon diving and area exploration. Plenty of understated strings and guitar to keep you company run after run, and despite the game's difficult and often frantic nature, it rarely kicks up the intensity unless you're in a boss fight. That's where all your heavy percussion and choir vocals come in. The game's sound design beyond its soundtrack is really quite good too, especially in relation to combat. The satisfying clang of a powerful critical hit or the chunky sound of a monster exploding into bloody pixels is just icing on top of Dead Cells' already delicious gameplay. Finally, as a roguelike, Dead Cells has plenty of replay value since no two runs will ever be exactly alike, and its core gameplay is satisfying enough that I find myself wanting to play it even just for a few minutes here and there. It's seriously tough to put down, especially with the slew of constant rewards you get if you play well. I haven't even mentioned the daily challenges and hidden challenge dungeons, which are just super hard. With all that said, Dead Cells is excellent. While I was drawn in by the game's Metroid-vania aspects, it's the super polished roguelike elements that really hooked me. With its satisfying gameplay, its wide variety of weapons and skills, and its use of Metroid-vania style unlocks as marks of hard progression, I found Dead Cells almost impossible to put down. Sure, its story could be laid out a little better and probably benefit from having a more focused, handcrafted world to explore, but then you'd lose out on some of what makes Dead Cells really fun to play. That is, the procedurally generated elements. As it stands, I can't recommend this game highly enough, whether you love roguelikes, Metroidvanias, or just awesome video games in general.